global poverty, which is probably one of the most well-known and popular cause areas in effective altruism. So despite decades of global development programs and initiatives, some of which have made amazing progress in several regions, about 10% of the world's population still lives in extreme poverty. Many of these people lack access to clean water, basic healthcare, primary education, and adequate shelter. So this panel will address the enormous challenges which remain in the area of global poverty, focusing on how we can use EA ideas to inform decisions about what programs to support and where to allocate scarce resources. The discussion will cover both development research and practice, and the various interacting roles of government and private organisation. So alongside Catherine, we have Kandasai Griffiths from Gradient Health Systems, Vikstrom from the Kandasai, and Grace Hollister from Evidence Action. And the moderator for this panel is Kieren Watkins. So Kieren is a science graduate from Monash University and has been involved in EA since 2013. He's mainly interested in alleviating global poverty and reducing animal suffering, and is interested in getting to clean meat research afterwards. So can we get a round of applause for Kieren?
Thanks for everyone coming. So we'll get started. First question I had was that Rob Whitlam recently mentioned on the 80,000 Hours podcast that he thought that the effective altruism community is generating so much knowledge about effective intervention in global health. And he's surprised that not more EAs are going in and starting their own charities using these interventions. I was just wondering, do you think that Rob is correct? And do you think it is a problem if he's correct?
I can say a quick thing about that, which is some of the incubation grants that we've made have been to EAs who are starting charities and interested in sort of this particular problem. And one of our goals with that program is to incentivize more people to do just that by showing that there is funding available if that's something that you're interested in doing. And I definitely think that there is a lot of potential within the space that still hasn't been explored for charities and for program research.
Yeah, I don't know if a lot of EAs are starting organizations or not, but in terms of starting an organization, before we say if it's a good or a bad thing, I think we need to explore other options as well. So first of all, there are so many good organizations out there already. They're doing amazing things and they have the solutions to a lot of problems. So looking perhaps at those first and seeing if they need resources, funding, or if they need staff where EAs can maybe help, I think would be a good start as well. And then if they don't have the solutions, they don't need the funding, you don't need the staff, then opening the organization could be a good idea.
I would very much agree with that. And just to add on, it's not easy to start your own organization, and it requires a lot more than just interest in a particular subject area. Getting funding is a challenge. Operations is a challenge. So I would very much agree. It's not to say that there isn't space for new organizations, but I would encourage people to think long and hard before making that their first choice.
Definitely agree. I mean, it's fantastic to have new members entering this space, but to both of their points, it's not always the case to recreate the wheel in using the resources and organizations that are already existing, helping them move further, and then if there is a gap, then filling that.
That's a good point. And I was just curious, many effective altruists try to alleviate global poverty by donating to the most effective charities actually doing direct work, like GiveWell recommends. But comparatively few actually donate to improve the efficacy of the money already spent by by corporations and governments and intergovernmental organizations. And so do you think this could be worth a bet on increasing the efficacy by altering the funding to where it goes? And is it worth the trade-off that it's losing out on helping the ineffective programs?
I can start here. As you can tell by my accent, I'm American. But one thing that comes to play here is the perception issue. So for example, 25% of Americans believe that, 75% of Americans believe that 25% of American spending goes to foreign assistance. In reality, that number is much less than 1%. And so when we talk about reallocating funding, really understanding the facts and presenting that information and factual backing is really important there.
I also think there are concrete challenges with how you would go about doing that. So like, I'm not sure if I want to donate in order to get the government to spend its money more effectively, how that would be done. It's something GiveWell, I mean, we're interested in exploring this question of like, are there ways in which we can better understand how government funds are allocated and whether there's anything we can do to share evidence that helps them be allocated more effectively. But I think it's a pretty big challenge, and it's really unclear to me right now if that's your interest, how you would go about doing that.
Does it come back at all a little bit to your point yesterday and today about looking into organisations working on advocacy and policy? If we can support them a little bit more, they may themselves be able to improve the effectiveness of government funding and corporate funding.
Yeah, it's definitely something that we're looking into, but it's all early enough stage that I don't know what action I would guide someone to take today if that was the thing that they were hoping to do.
I guess the other thing I would add here is some organizations, I'm just speaking from my own perspective, I do a lot of speaking to governments about evidence-based policy, and so I think for many charities that could be part of what they're doing in their day-to-day, because at least through the Do-One the World initiative, that program is implemented by government, so it cannot be successful without their buy-in, and they contribute in lots of different ways. I think that's, and domestic financing from country governments is certainly one potential answer. I don't think we need to talk about only the budgets of developed countries in this discussion, is really trying to get governments across the world to think about what's most effective for the population that they are serving. From the perspective of perhaps the Australian government or the American government, having governments understand that this is important and that there is work going on in this space can at least be, it helps to change, I think, the mindset overall. And I think what we have seen, at least in the past decade, is that there are actually efforts being made in many governments. I used to work at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is really a different way of doing aid within the US government for the purpose of looking more at evidence, looking at stronger monitoring and evaluation. The Australian government has some small, again, these are usually small, but they're looking at doing that more. And so I think that is somewhat in response to the overall ecosystem, but these types of things will continue to build on each other. The more that there is evidence of effectiveness and that programs are working, that's what governments will look towards as well. Even again, if it's only a small fraction, it could be a growing fraction of their budget.
Okay, thanks for that. Do you think that effective altruists should try to spend more time and energy researching and endeavouring to change the systemic roots of poverty, rather than, or do you think this is too intractable?
Depends on what your goal is.
Reduce suffering the most amount, I guess?
Well, I would say you have to, I think there's, so research into intractable roots of poverty, my view is we should be helping people now and today. So I come from a very particular perspective, but I think people can, the roots of poverty are, there's a lot to go on there. So that you could tackle that, I suppose, in many different ways, but I would advocate for people spending their time and money on the things that we know can help solve people's problems now.
I would also add the caveat that poverty is relative and it depends on the context and the other things affecting it. So understanding those root causes is a really key part of that, but also looking at what are we creating? Is it economic growth, economic opportunities? Is it systemic, related to gender or ethnic group or those types of things as well, and looking at what we're creating as opposed to just eliminating poverty, but creating those outlets to move forward.
Okay. So development aid has been given to developing countries for decades. In many cases, you can't really see many results. Should we be re-evaluating the overall effectiveness of foreign aid as a tool for poverty reduction?
So I'll start. So I made, for those of you who saw my presentation, I did make a comment about how much extreme poverty has declined in the last 25 years or so. It's about 70%, I think. So I think it's a bit of an overstatement to say that aid doesn't work. It's not to say, I mean, there has been a lot of money spent and maybe not as much to show for it as we would like, but I think at least, and particularly in the past few decades, that has improved. I'm not sure what the alternative to aid would be. So I think one has to evaluate it in the context of, if not this, then what?
My background is in fundraising, so I can't comment on the specific technical question there, but in terms of when speaking to the donors and people who want to get involved and donate money, that's one of the biggest hesitations around donating. That's like bottomless pit, it never gets better, so I think we need to really get better at telling the positive stories as well, the story about progress. And there's been a lot of progress, but we don't tend to hear about it that much, unfortunately.
I think, for GiveWell, one of the things that we do want to, one of the impacts that we're hoping to have is demonstrating that there are programs that, are highly evidence-backed and that we do believe to be really effective. And so hopefully empowering people who might think, oh, maybe aid doesn't work, to think, well, there are certain things that, we can feel good about working. And so, I think that's something that we're hoping to impact on the world.
So when we're trying to advocate for using resources to reduce global poverty rather than other cause areas, do you see one major advantage is the knock-on effect of interventions in helping people pull themselves out of poverty? In comparison, for example, any charity trying to advocate for increased farm welfare probably won't change the farmer's mind, and the only change they're going to get is the change they push for.
I'm not sure I totally follow that
Oh.
one, sorry.
So essentially, let's say we wanted to get rid of battery cages. Then we might be able to lobby the government, and then the government would change the law. And then the farmers would respond and comply with the new regulations, but they wouldn't want to do anything more. In comparison, if you, for example, give someone a malaria net, if you give a lot of people malaria nets, then it increases, for example, education. And then the education helps pull the community out of poverty. So there are, the effects are more than you initially anticipated given the intervention.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in terms of thinking about sort of like knock-on or secondary effects, for GiveWell, we are mostly focused on sort of the near term, do we think that an insecticide treated net averts a death from malaria? But we also have a view that, not getting malaria as a child might lead you to, have a more fulfilling life and maybe to improve your community and to be able to affect like positive change where you are. So I think that we see knock-on effects as potentials, but we don't measure them. So for GiveWell, they aren't as sort of primary in our recommendations.
Okay. So I think we already heard Grace's opinion, but do you think the case is stronger for give now or give later?
I think it depends on your personal situation. And for example, if you're running a successful business, it might be better to invest in that and grow that and then give later. But I think no matter what you do or who you are, I think you can always give a little now. So for example, with Life You Can Save, we have a quite low minimum recommendation. So we talk about giving at least 1%. So for example, even if you spend or give $2 a day, that's $60 a month, or about $730 a year, which quickly adds up. So if you can't give 10% now, at least give a little bit.
I like that framing as well of giving today in order to sort of keep yourself thinking about these issues. So even if you, and I understand there's quite a lot of writing on this, like in the EA community and on the Effective Altruism forum, and I think that maybe the Global Priorities Institute, like another website, has like a big write-up on this that I've seen. But I do think like one of the things that I find really compelling is this idea of, you know, even if I come to the conclusion that I should be giving more later, that giving now really forces me to think about important issues, and that I think that that's worth valuing some and thinking about giving now versus later.
I'd also add the caveat that giving doesn't have to just be financial. There are a lot of important charities that want your time, want your efforts, your strengths and talents. And also, if we're talking about donor funding, they need your opinions to representatives that it's important to you, and looking at how you can give in your current state, whether you're a student or just starting out in your career, and also what you want that to look like long term.
I'll just qualify to say that I was talking about people's lives sort of in the present, not necessarily giving like today or this year, but rather for people who are alive at the current moment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Sorry for misunderstanding. So how do you see the role of investment in comparison to donation for alleviating poverty?
What kind of investment?
Investment, so like at some people view, for example, the Marshall Project as a massive transformation in developing countries, and the critique would be, rather than donating where you've spent the money and you can't get it back, then investment, you grow your money over time, and at the same time you're investing in people being able to run businesses, for example, and so that could help them out of poverty at the same time as making you money.
There's a lot, I would say that the jury's still out. Everything's still very new. If we look at impact investing, social impact bonds are just starting out and within the past 5 or 10 years or so. So I think it'll take several years for us to figure out what that looks like. But for me personally, I find it really exciting, especially as public funding goes down and private investment comes into the development space. It makes it a very challenging market, but also exciting.
And from a fundraising perspective, I can add that I've noticed a lot of people getting quite excited about this as well. So it might help bring in new people that traditionally wouldn't have thought about donating, but because of that investment angle, they get excited about that and then start investing and also giving donations.
I think I already answered this one.
Right.
Part of the
So social impact bonds, is that like a bond, like a treasury bond, that type of thing, or?
Yeah, there are a couple different variations, and I'm definitely not an expert in this regard, so I encourage you to look it up. But there are a couple different versions, focus on some of those more intangible, whether it's education or looking at social growth, not in just a 5-year project, but maybe looking at 10 years or 20 years within a community, and seeing it as a long-term investment. So maybe you put in $100 for the economic growth of this small town, and then reaping the benefits of it down the line. So, still very early stages, but I think there's a lot of promise down the line.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. Okay, so is the greatest problem that global poverty poses, do you think, the suffering it inflicts or the flourishing it inhibits? Next question. Okay. Rather than trying to tackle poverty itself, should there be innovations actually just trying to improve subjective well-being rather than the financial situation? Because, for example, studies have shown the low influence of development and economic prosperity in South Korea and Japan, where it developed during the 20th century.
I think if you're a child watching your child die because they didn't have clean water and they have diarrhea and you can't stop it, I'll stop.
Yeah, I'll second that, but also in situations that are getting better, so whether it's improvement, maybe it could be a combination of both.
Can I just stop there to ask some of the poly questions, if that's okay? So these are just directed to the entire panel, so you can answer. Most of the top charities seem to be one of interventions, such as antibiotics distribution. What are your thoughts on effectiveness of infrastructure strengthening versus direct service charities?
So I think the question is referring to the GiveWell top charities as being pretty direct service oriented versus infrastructure strengthening. I think we have aimed to try to find things where we do believe that there is a sort of very strong evidence base, as I mentioned, and also like a very sort of compelling causal case for impact. And I think infrastructure strengthening can mean a lot of different things, but I think we have not sort of found things in that space that either meet that criteria or governments are already funding them or others are involved with the funding of those things such that we haven't sort of found opportunities with room for more funding. So those would be sort of my two kind of core concerns. One is what would the evidence base look like for infrastructure strengthening on the outcomes that we care most about, which generally have tended to be averting deaths or increasing incomes. I think with infrastructure, it probably also we would have some like generalizability questions about evidence that we see of some infrastructure improvement that works in one place and how it would work in another context, and then also the room for more funding question there.
Grace, did you have any thoughts on this?
It's from an evidence perspective, it's very hard to have a counterfactual for an infrastructure investment, so it's very hard to generate the evidence that at least from the evidence action perspective, that we would find compelling to do that. I would agree with Catherine also that our infrastructure tends to be something that's quite well funded by bilateral donors, World Bank, and is probably, there's less of a gap there in terms of funding needs.
So this next question is quite topical, but hasn't really been touched on yet. So increasing economic prosperity is intuitively a good idea for well-being outcomes. However, in some economically well-off societies, rates of mental health issues seem to challenge this intuition. How can we be sure that economic wins actually increase how much people are enjoying their lives more? And if I could get an answer from everyone, that would be great.
I feel uniquely unqualified to address this question. I would say we can't, but if you're looking at the levels of consumption in a country like Australia or a country like America, and you're looking at the levels of consumption in places like the places where we work and the schools that I visit when I go to India or to Kenya and see children who are being dewormed, it's not comparable. I don't think that we're at any risk of creating environments where people will start having mental health problems because they just stare at their phones all day, or whatever is causing that. I think that's I've seen some research that seems like it's part of that. But I think these people they're not going to all of a sudden be spoiled for choice of who's got the best latte around. It's a very different paradigm.
Yeah, I also feel a little bit unqualified to answer that question. I'm just passing it on to you first. If someone as a donor is very interested in both areas, I think it's always good to look at the evidence, but also make a decision based on your head and your heart. So if you're really passionate about an area and want to support different areas, that's also something that I think people should be considering.
Also find this a challenging question. But I think it also is an important reminder for us sitting in this space of privilege to be able to talk about these problems and not living through them ourselves, to recognize that we might not know best. And so really listening to those that we're working with, that we're talking to, that we're not inhibiting that progress by saying, oh, well, maybe this would happen, or maybe that longer term effect, as opposed to the real needs that they're facing today.
Yeah, I would agree, focusing on the near-term needs and not being sure what the long-term effects are. But also, mental health is an area, GiveWell has looked into some, like in the poorest parts of the world, and thinking about whether there are interventions there where we could be helpful. I think that's a little different than the question framing, which was tying it a bit more to how changes in people's economic situations might lead to mental health problems, which I do not feel qualified to answer. But I do think that mental health is a space in which there might be potential for us to be helpful in the near term, to the extent that there are programs and interventions oriented around mental health challenges. And sort of in a related space, one of the incubation grants that we made last year was to a group that's working on advocacy to governments to encourage them to ban the most lethal types of pesticide that are commonly used in suicides. And they're working in India and Nepal. And so there may well be spaces for GiveWell or EA-oriented donors to be involved with this issue sort of in the near term. But we haven't recommended anything in that space quite yet as a top charity. It's just an area that we have, it's on our radar.
Yeah, it is a challenging question, but something that needs to be spoken about more, particularly in the EA community. Fortunately, tomorrow we have a session by Brock Bastian on mental health and wellbeing at 12:30. So if you have any more questions, you can ask him that. So next question, many of the global catastrophic risks will impact those in poverty the most, such as climate change or pandemic outbreaks. Bridget mentioned yesterday in the panel the importance of prevention. Do you think we should be pushing this much more than we currently are?
Yeah, I think cross-cause prioritization, it's challenging for me sitting where I sit to say what the right allocation is across different causes like global catastrophic risks versus global health. Like I obviously am very aware of the issues within global health and development and the ways in which we can be helpful on those today. I do think Holden Karnofsky's blog post on the Open Philanthropy Project about some of the ways donors might think about comparisons across causes and how to prioritize is a really helpful resource if you're thinking about these questions. But I see so much immediate need, and I'm very steeped in the current kind of GiveWell look where we see malaria funding gaps, as I mentioned last night, for $640 million for nets today. And so we're really focused as an organization on trying to get those types of opportunities filled.
I would say it's also a tricky one. It seems like the pandemic issue at least is coming much more to the fore in places like World Health Organization and things like that. And so I think, as I was saying before about sort of creating an ecosystem where these issues need to be addressed, I think that could be an interesting role for the EA community because I think there hasn't been a lot of focus on that and there hasn't been a lot of funding, I think, globally dedicated to that in the past.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for, so can we please put our hands together and thank our panelists.